Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms. I'm Lisa Edwards, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'll be your host for today's show. I'm joined today by Daniel Casse, President of G100 Chief Executive Group and Managing Partner of High Lantern Group, a strategy and communication firm. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
Really excited to have you here. We have a bunch of questions, and the first is really going to be covering a topic that might seem basic, but it does stump a lot of executives, and it's how to give a solid and engaging presentation to the board. Daniel, why don't we start off by having you tell us some of the things that people often get wrong when they present to the board?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the question, appreciate being here. I've talked to over 100 CEOs and directors over the last decade or so. And one of the things that came up all the time was how unhappy they were, dissatisfied they were with the quality of presentations that came from executives. And it wasn't because people weren't trying or that they didn't understand them, but it failed on the engagement level. They didn't feel that they were either understanding or getting the right level of engagement. So I think the three mistakes that people make all the time are, first, they come in with crowded, heavy, dense slides that are a list, and they go through it really over one thing after another. A second thing is that they're not actually addressing the board. They're addressing their boss, the CEO in the room, which they're used to because they speak to the CEO all the time. But the board doesn't have that level of understanding. And you have to realize this is for a different group of people who don't understand the business in the same way. And I think the third mistake people make is that they're too quick to get off the stage. I know time is tight, but they usually say, "Thank you, any questions?" And it's as if they just want this over with, as opposed to their most important role, which is setting up a discussion.
Really great. And, I think a lot of people fail to recognize that almost every one of those presentations is in some ways an interview for a bigger role at the company or succession planning, checkbox kind of thing. So very important to have your act together, certainly. So what are your tips for executives to just get better at this, to get better at giving a board presentation?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I hear when I speak or coach people who are presenting before the board, invariably they always tell me, "Oh, it's just an update. They just want an update on what I'm doing. They just want an update." And at some level, that's always true. You're giving the board an update on where a certain function is or where you are. But I think that's usually inadequate for a engaging, robust presentation. I think the board wants to know, you're an expert, you're a professional, you manage a large P&L. What's your point of view? Give us a perspective. What are you struggling with? What are you trying to move towards? And what are you trying to improve on? Yes, it's an update, but it's an update towards a certain strategic or operational goal that the board has to know. So bring a point of view, a perspective that you want the board's feedback on. I think the second thing is, it's related to the audience itself. The board's a really special audience. They're not customers. They're not colleagues. Some of them have been on the board for 20 years. Some of them are sitting in their second board meeting. So the level of variety of understanding of your business or your particular problem is broad. So you have to figure out, one of the people I interviewed, Ron Sugar, who's the chair of Uber, is on the Apple board and a number of other boards, said, figure out how to fly at the right altitude, given the subject and the audience. Who needs to understand this? What level of expertise do they already have? And what is it that you want to convey so that the right people can engage? And the third piece of advice, and I alluded to it earlier from your earlier question, is don't just get off the stage. Set up the questions that you really want them to engage in. I mean, in many cases on boards, you've got real expertise in that room on cybersecurity, on retail, on operations. And sometimes you're in midstream of a project. And what you want to do is be able to tell them, this is what I'm working on, but this is what I'm not sure. This is what I need validation on. I tell people to actually write out the questions and put it on a slide and put that in front of everyone. And it will focus and channel the discussion in a way that helps you the most. a board presentation ought to be a discussion where people interested in the company's future learn from somebody who has deep knowledge about one aspect of it.
I love that. And, I think it's really important to also, just understand the different roles on the board. And to your point, some people are deep, deep, deep in it, have been in it for years, understand everything and all of the players. And some people are, really getting up to speed. It's super hard for, the presenter to sort of figure that out, but it's actually not that hard to do a little homework in advance and figure out, sort of what people's backgrounds are and what they're likely to be asking you questions about. So I guess on that note, how does your advice change depending on which persona is presenting to the board? So if a CEO is handling a board presentation versus like a CIO or a CMO or a CHRO, how does that presentation change depending on who the presenter is?
So if it's the CEO, it's a unique relationship. The board's the CEO's boss. And that relationship is different from everyone else's. So the CEO both has to be transparent, has to be confident, and has to bring the board decisions about where the company is going, not for them to make the decisions, but them to add a perspective. I think the CEO presentation is a result of a series of ongoing relationships. CEOs in touch both individually and with the board itself on a regular basis. So in that case, many cases, it is an ongoing conversation. But for everyone else, it's different. That appearance before the board may happen once a year or twice a year. If you're a CFO, more frequently. But I still think some rules apply. And that rule is, what is it that you know about the business? You're a CFO, you're head of marketing, you're head of communications. What is it that not only that you know, but that you can share your insight, your perspective, and even your problems and your concern and your anxiety with us, the board? I don't want a polished outside pitch that you might make to a customer. I want to know what it's like to run your part of the business. What are you struggling with? What are you trying to achieve? They want your knowledge that they for sure don't have. And frankly, they're not going to get from the CEO, whose perspective is much bigger. So take the knowledge that you do have and figure out a way to share it, including the things that you're not certain about. You want their validation, but you also want their feedback, their perspective, because they may have seen this at another company, one they worked at, or one where they're currently serving on another board.
I love that. Maybe continue on that for one more second in that, if how do you avoid surprising your boss, the CEO, when one of those board questions comes out? You're not necessarily sure what the correct answer is in terms of, alignment with your CEO, but the board is asking you a direct question. Did you get any feedback on that?
Yeah, I think this rule is universal. There are no surprises in the boardroom for the CEO. You work with the CEO because you are aligned with him or her, and you're aligned on a team. If a CEO is surprised in a boardroom, that's generally considered a failure. So you may get a question out of left field, but I sort of think if you get a bad question, in some ways it's the presenter's fault. What you're doing is channeling the conversation towards a common understanding of the things that you know about your business, and your CEO shares that perspective. Boardroom is not the place where you just shoot from the hip and make up an answer that you've never shared with your boss. That's not the place for it. Those are private meetings you would have with your CEO or an internal leadership team meeting. At the boardroom, you are channeling the conversation to the areas you know best.
That's great. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that brings us to the end of our time today. So thank you, Daniel, for walking us through these best practices. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you can find an article that Daniel wrote on this topic in a recent Harvard Business Review article called 3 Ways to Nail Your Presentation to the Board. So look for that if you'd like more details. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week for another installment of Inside Today's Boardroom from Diligent Institute.